Meherin Qureshi left her home believing power would protect her, but the moment she stepped into Devraj Malhotra's world, her fate began to slip beyond her control. Meherin Qureshi searched for answers, while his family's name turned into a whispered scandal. In Canada, Sonal Verma noticed the cracks in a story that was never meant to be told. Inspector Caleb Moore followed a trail that powerful hands kept erasing. Every step forward revealed how easily a life could vanish when silence becomes currency. This is not just a disappearance, it is a warning hidden behind influence and immunity. Stay with this story till the end, because the truth waiting ahead is darker than anyone expects, and once you hear it, you won't forget it. Meherin Qureshi had always been known as a woman who lived within clear boundaries. Her days followed a predictable rhythm shaped by family responsibilities, routine prayers, and quiet evenings at home. Neighbors saw her as polite and reserved, someone who rarely drew attention to herself. Nothing in her behavior suggested that she was capable of making a sudden, life-changing decision. That is why what happened next left everyone stunned. The change began slowly, almost invisibly. Meherin started staying awake late into the night, her phone screen glowing long after the rest of the house had fallen asleep. At first, her family assumed it was harmless curiosity or boredom. Over time, her focus on the phone became intense. She guarded it closely and reacted nervously whenever someone entered the room. The warmth she once showed toward her family began to fade, replaced by silence and distraction. Small details began to feel wrong. Meherin stopped attending family gatherings. She avoided conversations and answered questions with short, empty responses. Her son noticed that she no longer asked about his studies or his friends. Her husband sensed an emotional distance that had never existed before. Yet no one imagined the truth hiding behind her sudden withdrawal. Behind closed doors, Meherin was living a second life. Emails and encrypted messages filled her nights. She was reading about Canada, diplomatic privileges, and international travel. A name appeared again and again in her private searches, Devraj Malhotra. To the outside world, he was a respected Indian ambassador, admired for his influence and power. To Meherin, he represented escape, validation, and a life far removed from her ordinary existence. What no one realized was how deeply she had become invested in this unseen connection. Meherin began questioning her own life choices. The routine she once accepted now felt suffocating. She imagined herself walking through foreign streets, free from expectations and judgment. The promises she believed she had been given made her feel important, chosen, and protected. Then came the morning that changed everything. Meherin woke before dawn, earlier than usual. The house was quiet. She moved carefully, as if afraid the walls themselves might stop her. She packed only the bare essentials, leaving behind clothes, jewelry, and personal keepsakes. Family photographs remained untouched on the shelves, collecting dust. She wrote no letter. There was no farewell message, no explanation, and no apology. She simply walked out of the house and closed the door behind her. By the time her family woke up, Meherin was already on her way to the airport. Hours later, her family discovered her passport missing. Panic set in. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. It wasn't until much later that they learned she had boarded an international flight bound for Canada. The realization struck like a shockwave. No one understood how or why she had left so suddenly. Days passed in confusion and disbelief. Then whispers began to circulate. A distant relative mentioned seeing Meherin's name connected to an Indian diplomat. Social media speculation grew louder. The idea seemed impossible, almost absurd, yet the evidence pointed in that direction. For her family, the humiliation was unbearable. Friends avoided eye contact. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Meherin's disappearance was no longer just a personal tragedy. It had become a public scandal. Her family struggled to defend her without knowing the truth themselves. What they didn't know was that Meherin believed she was stepping into a new beginning. She imagined safety, protection, and a future filled with importance. She believed that distance would erase her past and that power would shield her from consequences. But as the plane lifted off the runway, carrying Meherin away from everything she had known, no one could have imagined that this decision would lead not to freedom, but to a mystery far darker than anyone was prepared to face. And this was only the beginning. When Meherin Qureshi arrived in Canada, the reality waiting for her was nothing like the future she had imagined. The cold air, the unfamiliar streets, and the quiet distance of a foreign city immediately reminded her that she was completely alone. Yet she moved forward with confidence, believing that the promises she trusted would soon become real. From the outside, her arrival appeared smooth and well-planned. Beneath the surface, everything was unstable. Official records showed Meherin checking into high-end hotels in Ottawa. The locations suggested wealth and influence, but no one could explain who was paying for them. Her name appeared briefly in reservation systems and then vanished, as if deliberately erased. She never stayed long in one place. Within days, she would move to another hotel across the city, leaving no trail behind. Meherin began attending formal events where powerful figures gathered. Security cameras captured her entering buildings linked to diplomatic activity, yet her name never appeared on guest lists. Embassy staff noticed her presence but could not place her role. She was not introduced as a companion, advisor, or relative. She simply existed in the background, moving quietly between restricted spaces. So now Varma, a senior embassy staff member, was one of the first to sense something was wrong. She noticed repeated security clearance overrides connected to Meherin's movements. Each time questions were raised, the issue was dismissed without explanation. The silence surrounding Meherin's presence was intentional, and that made it dangerous. Meanwhile, Meherin cut all remaining ties to her past. Her phone number was deactivated. Her social media accounts were deleted. Even her email addresses went dark. Anyone trying to trace her path would find nothing but dead ends. It was as if Meherin had chosen to erase herself completely. Despite appearances, Meherin's position in Canada was fragile. She had no official visa connected to employment or family sponsorship. Her legal status depended entirely on invisible protection. Without it, she would have been detained or deported within weeks. This truth created constant pressure, forcing her to rely on people she barely understood. Her movements became increasingly restricted. She stopped traveling freely and began staying indoors for long periods. Staff at the hotels reported seeing her only at odd hours, always cautious, always watching. She appeared anxious, no longer confident. The independence she imagined was slowly replaced by fear. Financial records later revealed sudden cash deposits followed by large withdrawals. The money came from sources that could not be traced to any legitimate income. Shortly after, the flow stopped without warning. From that moment on, Meherin's situation changed dramatically. She began requesting meetings that never happened. Appointments were postponed, then cancelled. Messages went unanswered. The powerful protection she believed she had was quietly slipping away. What once felt like privilege now felt like isolation. Within weeks, Meherin disappeared from public view entirely. Hotel staff reported that her room had been vacated without formal checkout. Personal items were left behind, including clothing and documents. No forwarding address was provided. There was no sign of panic, but there was clear urgency. Internally, the embassy conducted no investigation. No report was filed. No concern was expressed. So now Varma attempted to document irregularities, but was instructed to stop. Files were sealed. Access was revoked. Outside official circles, no one knew Meherin existed. Without a family report in Canada, her disappearance went unnoticed. Without legal records, there was no proof she was even in the country. What Meherin failed to realize was that her life in Canada had been built on silence and convenience. And when silence was no longer useful, it became lethal. As days turned into weeks, the truth grew more dangerous with every unanswered question, setting the stage for a disappearance that would later shock everyone who tried to uncover it. Meherin Qureshi's disappearance did not happen suddenly. It unfolded in fragments, scattered across security footage, financial records, and unexplained gaps in time. By the moment anyone realized she was truly gone, too much had already been lost. There was no dramatic alarm, no immediate search. Her absence slipped quietly into the background, unnoticed by the city around her. The first official concern came from a local welfare organization that had been alerted by an unpaid hotel account linked to Meherin's name. Staff members tried contacting her repeatedly, but every attempt failed. With no response and no forwarding details, they filed a routine notice. It was the only reason her name entered any system at all. Security footage from a private building near a diplomatic residence later became the most haunting piece of evidence. The video showed Meherin entering a black vehicle late at night. She appeared calm, not distressed, and carried only a small bag. The vehicle's license plate was obscured, and the driver was never identified. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. In the days that followed, unusual movements occurred behind closed doors. Internal embassy schedules were abruptly altered. Certain staff members were reassigned without explanation. Digital logs showed access to restricted areas during hours when no official activity was scheduled. Each irregularity was minor on its own, but together they painted a troubling picture. Shortly after Meherin vanished, Devraj Malhotra left Canada under the cover of an emergency diplomatic transfer. The departure was processed with unusual speed. No farewell events were recorded. No press statements were released. Within hours, he was gone, taking with him any chance of immediate accountability. When authorities attempted to gather information, they encountered walls at every turn. Requests for documentation were denied or delayed. Surveillance data was incomplete. Witness statements were vague. Diplomatic immunity cast a long shadow, limiting how deeply investigators could probe. Inspector Caleb Moore was assigned to the case, though at the time it was not treated as a homicide. Without a body, without a crime scene, and without public pressure, the investigation was classified as low priority. Still, Moore noticed patterns that bothered him. Financial activity linked to Meherin's accounts ended abruptly on the night she disappeared. No purchases, no withdrawals, no transfers followed. Her digital footprint stopped entirely, as if someone had pressed a switch. Even automated background systems showed no movement tied to her identity. Witnesses from hotels and nearby buildings remembered seeing her in the weeks before she vanished. They described her as increasingly tense, often looking over her shoulder. She asked unusual questions about exits and transportation. She never allowed staff to enter her room while she was present. Then, without warning, internal communication from the embassy declared the matter closed. There would be no further cooperation. Files referencing Meherin were archived and sealed. Inspector Moore was reassigned to other cases, and the trail went cold. Back in Lahore, Meherin's family continued to wait for answers. They sent emails, made calls, and contacted international agencies, but received nothing in return. Without official confirmation of her presence in Canada, no formal missing person case could move forward. Months passed. Rumors replaced facts. Some believed Meherin had started a new life under a different identity. Others suspected she had been silenced. No one had proof of either. What made the case especially disturbing was not what investigators found, but what they couldn't find. There were no traces, no communications, no witnesses willing to speak. It was as if Meherin had been carefully removed from the world. By the time attention returned to her case, the question was no longer where she was, but whether she was still alive. And somewhere, hidden beneath layers of power and silence, the truth waited, ready to surface in the most unexpected way. Nearly a year after Meherin Qureshi vanished, her name resurfaced in the most unexpected and chilling way. Along a quiet stretch of the Ottawa River, fishermen reported something tangled among driftwood near the shore. At first glance, it appeared to be debris carried by the current. When authorities arrived, it became clear that the river had revealed what had been hidden for months. The remains were badly decomposed and incomplete, making identification difficult. Time, water, and wildlife had erased most recognizable features. The discovery immediately raised concern, but no one connected it to Meherin at first. The case was logged as an unidentified body, one of many that passed through forensic labs each year. Weeks turned into months as specialists worked slowly through the evidence. Bone analysis suggested the remains belonged to a woman. Age estimates matched Meherin's profile, but that alone was not enough. DNA testing was requested through international channels, a process delayed by bureaucracy and legal restrictions. When confirmation finally arrived, it sent shockwaves through everyone who had followed the case quietly from a distance. The remains belonged to Meherin Qureshi. The woman who had vanished without a trace was no longer missing. She was dead. The forensic report revealed disturbing details. There were signs of blunt force trauma consistent with a violent encounter. The injuries occurred before death, ruling out accidental drowning. The pattern suggested that the body had been placed in the river deliberately, not carried there by chance. Inspector Caleb Moore was brought back into the investigation. With physical evidence now present, the case shifted from disappearance to homicide. Moore revisited every overlooked detail, every sealed file, and every unanswered question. Financial experts uncovered transactions made in Meherin's name shortly before her death. Large sums of cash had been withdrawn, followed by attempts to move funds through indirect channels. The accounts were linked to intermediaries connected to diplomatic networks. But the connections stopped just short of naming anyone directly. Security footage from river access points showed gaps during critical hours. Cameras had been disabled temporarily for maintenance that was never properly documented. The timing was precise enough to suggest planning. Despite the mounting evidence, progress remained slow. Diplomatic immunity complicated every step. Requests for interviews were ignored. Legal teams intervened before subpoenas could be issued. Each advance was met with resistance. So now Verma's name reappeared in internal memos. She had attempted to log discrepancies weeks before Meherin vanished. Her notes referenced unauthorized access and unexplained transfers. Shortly after the body was identified, so now resigned from her position. Within days, her public records disappeared, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Publicly, the case received minimal attention. Official statements described the death as under investigation, without details. No suspects were named. No arrests were made. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted to keep the matter contained. For Meherin's family, the confirmation was devastating. The hope of reunion was replaced by the certainty of loss. They received a clinical report, but no explanation. There was no closure, only grief flared with unanswered questions. As Inspector Moore reviewed the final evidence, one conclusion became unavoidable. Meherin's death was not a random act of violence. It was the result of calculated decisions made by people who understood how to operate in shadows. The river had given back what power tried to hide, but it did not reveal who was responsible. And as the investigation slowed once again, it became clear that Meherin's story was far from over. The truth was still waiting, buried beneath influence, immunity, and fear. When the investigation officially slowed, silence filled the spaces where answers should have been. Files were marked inactive, evidence was archived, and Meherin Qureshi's case quietly drifted out of public attention. On paper, the matter remained open. In reality, it had been buried under procedure, influence, and exhaustion. What remained was a story without justice, and a truth no one seemed willing to claim. Meherin's family in Lahore received the final confirmation through formal channels. The report was brief, factual, and stripped of emotion. It confirmed her identity, the cause of death, and little else. There was no explanation of how she reached the river, who was with her in her final moments, or why her life had ended the way it did. For her family, the pain was not just her death, but the absence of meaning behind it. Public interest faded quickly. News outlets avoided deep coverage. Online discussions disappeared as fast as they appeared. The involvement of powerful institutions created an invisible barrier that few were willing to cross. Meherin's name became a quiet reference rather than a headline. Devraj Malhotra continued his diplomatic career without interruption. His international postings changed, his public appearances remained polished, and his record stayed clean. No official document ever linked him directly to Meherin's death. The lack of evidence was not proof of innocence, but it was enough to ensure protection. Inspector Caleb Moore reviewed the case one final time before stepping away. The patterns were clear to him, even if they could not be proven. The sudden withdrawal of support, the erased records, the perfectly timed disappearance, and the controlled silence all pointed in one direction. Yet without cooperation, the truth could not survive in a courtroom. So now Verma was never located. Her resignation letter remained the last trace of her existence in official records. Attempts to find her led nowhere. It was as if she too had learned the cost of knowing too much. What made Meherin's story especially haunting was how ordinary it began. She was not a criminal, a spy, or a public figure. She was a woman who believed in promises, trusted power, and thought she was protected. Her decision to abandon her family was judged harshly, but her fate revealed a far darker reality. The narrative surrounding Meherin shifted over time. Some framed her as reckless. Others called her naive. Few acknowledged the imbalance of power that shaped her choices. Fewer still questioned how easily someone could vanish when their presence became inconvenient. Years later, her case remained officially unsolved. No memorial stood in her name. No courtroom ever spoke her story out loud. The river that carried her remains returned to its quiet flow, holding secrets it would never give back. What lingered was a warning hidden inside her disappearance. Influence can erase footsteps. Immunity can silence truth. And when personal lives collide with powerful systems, it is often the powerless who disappear first. Meherin Qureshi left her home, believing she was walking toward a new life. Instead, she stepped into a world where promises were temporary and protection had limits. Her remains were found, but the truth behind her death remains missing. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. Not that she died far from home, but that the world moved on so easily, leaving her story behind as just another unsolved shadow waiting to be remembered.